is EWA Radio, the podcast of the Education Writers Association. I'm public editor and your host, Kavitha Cardoza. I'm so excited to welcome Mirtha Donastorg. She's now a reporter with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, but while she was at The Plug, she was the only reporter covering historically Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs as they're called, full-time in the country. Mirtha, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thank you so much for having me, Kavitha. It's great being here.
Before we start talking about HBCUs, Mirtha, how did you start getting involved in reporting on them? Did you go to one?
No, I didn't attend an HBCU. I got involved in HBCU innovation coverage through Report for America, the nonprofit organization. They're trying to revitalize local journalism. And so in becoming part of that program, I joined the newsroom, The Plug, which was a research and insights platform examining the Black innovation economy. And so as one of the verticals, we had HBCU innovation. So I did not go to an HBCU, but I can see from my experience at predominantly white institution, I went to North Carolina State University, just kind of the value of an HBCU. I felt, while I had a great education, I also did feel a lot of being the one and only in classes in different spaces, being just kind of different and other. So having that experience of not necessarily always fitting in also kind of drew me to covering HBCUs, because I was really, personally curious about what would it have been like if I had a different experience.
That is the perfect lead-in to our conversation. And I was going to try a slightly different format today from what we usually do, Mirtha. Mm-hmm. We are going to talk about 9 things you learned about covering HBCUs. How did they get started?
What an HBCU is at least according to the Department of Education, that definition is basically any college or university that was founded before 1964, before the Civil Rights Act, and their express purpose was to educate Black folks. So essentially, these were institutions that were made to educate people when slavery or segregation were legal. The first HBCU was started in 1837, and in many cases, the HBCUs were started by white philanthropists. So the first one that I mentioned, 1837, that was Cheyney University. It's in Pennsylvania. And it was started at the bequest of a Quaker philanthropist who gave some land for a school to be built to teach freed slaves. And it kind of grew from there. And they all have history before 1964.
Okay, let's start with number 9. And again, this is not in any particular order. HBCUs are not a monolith.
Right. Like I said, the only thing that makes an HBCU is their history. They are historically Black colleges and universities. And so what they are now in the present is incredibly diverse. According to the definition by the Department of Education, there are more than 100 accredited HBCUs, and they vary. There are 2-year schools, there are 4-year schools, and there are graduate-only schools, like, Meharry School of Medicine. It's an HBCU, but it's only, a medical school. 4 years, you think of the Spelmans, the Howards, Dillard University, Xavier University, and then there are a lot of 2-year schools as well. There is Drake State Technical College in Alabama. So they are not a monolith at all in terms of what kind of academics they have.
HBCUs are also all over, right?
Mm-hmm. They're also not a monolith in geography. They aren't all in the South. They aren't all in the Southeast. The University of Virgin Islands is an HBCU. You can find HBCUs as far north as Pennsylvania, Delaware, and as far west as Texas and Oklahoma. So that's another way that they are also very geographically different. And even in some cases, they are demographically different. There are some HBCUs that are now majority white. Bluefield State College, West Virginia State University, both of those are HBCUs in West Virginia that are majority white student body.
That is so interesting. I would never have known that some HBCUs are majority white.
That's a small minority of them, but there are a few.
Okay, number 7. There's a lot going on in HBCUs beyond what is typically covered, like sports and homecoming.
Yeah, definitely. And I think when it comes to HBCUs, especially in recent popular culture, you might think of Beyonce's Homecoming, like the tour and the movie. And that is kind of what people think about HBCUs a lot, or they might think of, other forms of popular culture, TV show, A Different World, things like that. But there's so much more that's happening beyond sports and beyond homecoming, which are great in and of themselves. But there's also a lot of research programs, corporate initiatives, especially in the past 3 years since 2020. There has just been almost like this, I don't want to say renaissance, because HBCUs have always been here and they've always been doing the work, but there's been a renewed sort of attention and effort put into HBCUs from, larger funders and corporations. Some really interesting stuff that I got to cover while I was at the Plug were, at Winston-Salem State University, they have an astrobotany research program. So, which blew my mind. They are literally...
What's that?
Astrobotany, I learned, is basically the study of plants in like a non-Earth space. So they literally grow tomatoes, peppers, in soil that's made to mimic Martian soil. So it has not been exposed to any organisms that live on this earth. And they're basically trying to see if they can grow plants in conditions that mimic different planets in outer space. And they are working with NASA on this research with the Kennedy Space Center, and they bring all of their findings to NASA, and they're working in collaboration to see if eventually we can grow plants elsewhere. That was really cool.
Wow.
Yes. And there's also, other different types of initiatives and collaborations that are happening. Like we can look at Apple. They have done a lot over the past few years in terms of different sort of HBCU innovation initiatives. They have invested millions for tech and coding curricula at HBCUs across the country. Tennessee State, they're doing a lot of work. At Alabama State, they're doing a lot of work. And then there are also initiatives and programs that are kind of coming from homegrown successes, celebrities, however you want to put it, like at Jackson State University. They were recently talked about a lot because of their football program and their football head coach. But, something that also happened in the past few months was the author, he is a layman who won a MacArthur Genius Grant within days of announcing that he had been given this massive, massive award. He also announced that he was going to move a literary arts program that he had established at the University of Mississippi, which was the flagship PWI of the state. He was moving
predominantly white.
Yes, the predominantly white institution of Mississippi, that he was moving it to Jackson State, and it was going to be housed at Jackson State in the same building where his mother was a professor at Jackson. So there's a lot of different layers of innovation, of research that is happening at HBCUs that people should look at, just beyond the sports headlines and the homecoming concerts.
Mm-hmm. Okay, number 6, and I'm so glad you included this because I feel like this is such a common misperception. Graduation rates are not the full picture.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I feel like when it comes to HBCUs, people kind of easily point to, okay, but what about the graduation rates? What does that mean? They aren't the full picture. I think that there are two things that you need to think about and look at when you are looking at graduation rates. So the first is tied to one of the things that HBCUs are really good at, which is social mobility. Basically, when students graduate from an HBCU, they're more likely to get to higher rungs of the economic ladder than their families did. And research bears that out, that if you go to a predominantly white institution, that you don't reach there, you're not as likely to reach as far as if you went to an HBCU. One of the reasons behind that, of course, is that HBCUs, which harkens back to their history and their mission, they often accept a lot of low-income students. So there is a lot more movement that a student from, one of the bottom percentiles can make. But in accepting more low-income students who, didn't necessarily have the best elementary, middle, high school education, it's kind of a double-edged sword, and it shows up in graduation rates, which research also shows out that low-income students are a lot less likely to get their bachelor's degree in 6 years, which is the metric that you find for the Department of Education. Students from high-income backgrounds, they are 5 times more likely to graduate than those from the lowest income. So that is something that you need to think about when you're looking at graduation rates. You need to look at the population of the student body and if there are any other outside factors that can be, influencing just a small emergency. You say, your car had some mechanical trouble. For a lot of students at HBCUs, that can be the difference between them graduating or not, if they can pay tuition for the next semester or not. Mm-hmm. So that's something that you need to think about.
Number 5, HBCUs are underfunded, and that underfunding has broad and lasting impact. First, can you explain what you mean by underfunded, Mirtha, and then we'll go on to the impact?
Yeah, so I'd say underfunding essentially means that many local, state, and federal governments should have legally been allocating money to HBCUs for decades, but they didn't, or they weren't allocating the equivalent amounts as they were to the predominantly white institutions in their state. And we see this, Forbes came out with a really big piece last year showing that the Black land grant universities, so that's about 23 of HBCUs, they have been underfunded by at least $12.8 billion. And that's just over the last 3 decades, not even the life of the whole schools. Just over the last 3 decades, nearly $13 billion underfunded. And so that clearly has a lot of impacts. If they had been getting that $13 billion, what sort of infrastructure could they have built? What sort of academic programs could they have brought in? How many professors could they have, given tenure to? And it compounds. It's not just the impact right then in that year, but it builds on itself. And so that leads to the situation that a lot of HBCUs are in now with, millions of dollars worth of deferred maintenance that we can see kind of bear out in some of the recent protests, like Howard University students in 2021 doing the Blackburn takeover and talking about housing conditions, which is a real problem and impacts students' lives in the here and now. But it's kind of a symptom of something that has been happening for HBCUs pretty much their entire existence through underfunding.
So you would think this was obvious, but I mean, from like reading reports, it's kind of not that there are many experts on a variety of topics at HBCUs that have nothing to do with, Black history or Black culture or they're professors like anyone else.
Exactly. Yep. And I think that, and this is something that I would incorporate in some of the pieces that I wrote that weren't about HBCUs, but thinking there's probably an expert voice I can find at an HBCU. And, there were some recent high-profile hires at Howard University, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Nicole Hannah-Jones. Right. But there are a ton of experts in different fields like quantum mechanics. There's a Howard professor, Stephen Richardson, very, very wonderful professor. Had the pleasure of interviewing him, but he is an elected fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He does research with the National Science Foundation in quantum materials. He is also a professor of applied physics at Harvard University, and he is an expert voice at an HBCU. If you are interested in looking at academic programming, curriculum development, there is also Dr. Kathy Stromill Golden. She is a former Fulbright scholar, and she works at Mississippi Valley State University as a director of international programs. She could be also just like a general expert voice. But those are just two examples. You can also go to the HBCUs. Quite a few of them have curated, expert lists that you can find on their website for any sort of voice that you are looking for.
And I know you are going to curate a list for EWA members, and we're going to have a blog post on our website, ewa.org, so people can look there as well.
Right.
This actually ties in really well. The next thing you learned, Mirtha, which is point 3, communicating with HBCUs can sometimes be difficult. Tell me what you mean and why.
So this is something I've heard from a lot of reporters when I say I covered HBCU innovation. They're like, oh, I reached out to them, but I never heard back. They're talking about a local HBCU. And so I think that there are a few things about it. And honestly, it all boils down to like trust and having a relationship. There might be some mistrust in the media there might be some distrust of the media because often coverage only comes when there is something going wrong at an HBCU. There are a ton of outlets that when I would see them talk about an HBCU is because there were some protests or something that they could kind of latch onto. And so there might be some general distrust on the HBCU side of, what is your angle? Why are you approaching us now?
Or you only reach us when there's something negative.
Exactly. You only reach us when there's something negative to talk about. And so at the core of it, you just need to build a trusting relationship with HBCUs. And that can be you calling them up, just have a conversation on background, see what's going on at the school. You can also go visit and ask for a tour. I have been offered so many tours across so many states. I'm based in Atlanta, but I got invitations to come to New Orleans, to come to Mississippi, to just like walk around these campuses and to see what they had going on. And that can be a way of building that relationship so that when there is a story and when you do need comment on something, like you already have this relationship with somebody at the school and communicating won't be quite as difficult.
So point number 2, things I learned covering HBCUs. You say people are hungry for nuanced, in-depth reporting about HBCUs. Do you have story ideas, Mirtha, that you could share?
Yeah, I think there are a ton of trends to look at with HBCUs and a ton of day of news that is happening, but some story ideas that people should dig into. So in 2020, Mackenzie Scott gave $560 million to 23 HBCUs, completely unrestricted funding. What has the impact of that funding been? Millions of dollars that they could do whatever they want. I would suggest that if there is an HBCU in your area that got funding from Mackenzie Scott, looking at the impact of that unrestricted funding over the past 3 years. I think, another story idea is tied to the research programs that I had talked about earlier. There is a major push across state governments, through HBCU leaders and even federal officials and lawmakers to get an HBCU to R1 status, which means very high research activity. It's a status that is denoted by the Carnegie system, but basically it means that you are the highest tier of research university in this country. There has never been an HBCU at R1. There are currently 11 HBCUs at R2, which is about a step below R1. And I think looking at if there's an R2 HBCU in your area, what do their research efforts look like? Are they trying to become an R1 institution when the new Carnegie rankings are released next year? That's a great story to look at. And there's a lot of meat there.
The final point, Mirtha, is something that I have noticed every time I hear someone talk who's been to an HBCU, and that's people who love HBCUs, love HBCUs.
I love HBCUs, yeah. I was chatting with somebody yesterday who went to Howard University. He graduated in 1977, nearly 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. And he still talks about Howard with so much love and respect and excitement about his 4 years there. But I think that what it is there is a sense of identity that, mm-hmm. Comes from having attended an HBCU, of not being the one and the only, Black person in your classroom. Everybody looks like you. Your professors look like you. The administrators look like you. And so there's a sense of almost comfort that can come from that, because you don't have to be the representative for your entire race. As I felt often in college, not having gone to an HBCU. So there's this sense of comfort, identity, almost like a family that forms. And I think that is unique to HBCUs. I remember the first time I was ever in a big public area where everybody looked like me. And it was when I was studying abroad in Paris. I wasn't even in the United States, and I was at a music festival, and I was 20 years old. And I was just struck by the fact that I wasn't sticking out because of my hair, because of how I looked. I could just kind of be.
Right.
And that feeling really, really stuck with me, not being, an other. And I think at HBCUs, you have that feeling for, 4 years, not just one afternoon. And there's also research that shows that this isn't just a feeling, but attending an HBCU can actually have protective effects on your health, of not having what researchers call a stereotype threat kind of hanging over your head, where members of a marginalized group, they're afraid of confirming negative stereotypes about their group. A study from last year from Duke University found that HBCU students aren't impacted by that threat. And another study from a few years ago from Ohio State found that Black adults who attended an HBCU had less chance of developing a precursor to heart disease, diabetes, or stroke than Black adults who went to a predominantly white university. And so it's not just, this feeling and anecdotes, but there's actual research showing the protective effects of going to an HBCU.
Mm-hmm. Mirtha, we're almost at time, but you also started an incredible newsletter about HBCUs. Are you continuing with that in your new job, and can listeners sign up?
I unfortunately am not continuing with this newsletter, but the archives, at least on LinkedIn, still exist, as well as the archives of every HBCU article that I ever wrote and published on the plug. So listeners can still find that on tpinsights.com. You can just kind of go to the HBCU tab on the site and look at, I don't even know how many articles. I don't remember the exact number, but more than 100 for sure. And get story ideas or research or, potential sources. Yes, follow up on stories, threads that I started.
And we'll also have some of this information at EWA.org. But thank you so much, Mirtha. I am so appreciative of you talking to us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's something that I've become pretty passionate about, and I am really thankful to have been able to share with you.
We've been talking with Mirtha Donastorg. She is now with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, but as a reporter at The Plug, she covered HBCUs exclusively. You can follow her on Twitter at MJ Donastorg. That wraps up this episode of EWA Radio. I'm Kavitha Cardoza. Do you have any questions for Mirtha? Let's continue the conversation on Twitter at EdWriters. And if you have stories about HBCUs in your district or state, please share them. #TellEWA. Special thanks to Angelina Liu and Kristan Obang from EWA and Raul Garcia for production assistance. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and to improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 75 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Thanks for listening and lifting up education journalism.